Step outside or we'll drag you to our compliance center. That's what they barked at Nathan Daniels, thinking they could bully him with fake badges and flimsy handcuffs. But they didn't know they just woken a sleeping giant. In the manicured streets of Willow Creek, where every mailbox and lawn was held to a ruthless standard, a sinister scam lurked beneath the surface of suburban order. The Homeowners Association, once a symbol of community pride, had morphed into a predatory machine, extorting residents with absurd fines and threats of foreclosure over trivial violations. Enter Nathan Daniels, a volunteer deputy with an iron will and an unyielding sense of justice. What began as a confrontation over a mailbox escalated into a relentless crusade to expose a web of fraud, dismantle a corrupt HOA board, and restore power to a community crushed by greed. This is no ordinary tale of neighborhood drama. It's a gripping saga of defiance, betrayal, and triumph that will leave you questioning the true cost of unchecked power. Join us on HOA Karen Files as we dive into this explosive story of one man's stand against tyranny. Buckle up for a roller coaster of twists, from fake cops to secret bank accounts, and see how Willow Creek fought back. If you're hooked on stories of justice served and Karens brought to their knees, smash that subscribe button, hit the bell, and join our community in the comments to share your own HOA horror stories. Let's get started. Fake HOA thugs tried to arrest me over a mailbox. Here's how I exposed their massive scam. In the orderly suburb of Willow Creek, where conformity was law and deviations were punished, Nathan Daniels stood as a quiet sentinel of principle. A man of discipline, he lived by the rules but never bowed to tyranny. What began as an ordinary morning in his modest home escalated into a relentless battle against a sinister scam cloaked in the authority of the Homeowners Association, HOA. This is the story of Nathan's unyielding fight to expose fraud, dismantle corruption, and restore justice to a community held hostage by greed. The morning that changed everything. The first light of dawn crept through the blinds of Nathan Daniels' living room, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. At 6:47 a.m., the world outside Willow Creek was still, save for the faint chirping of sparrows and the occasional hum of a passing car. Nathan, a man in his early 40s with a weathered face that spoke of years spent upholding order, sat in his worn leather recliner. A steaming mug of black coffee rested in his left hand, its bitter aroma grounding him in the ritual of routine. In his right, he held the TV remote, though the screen remained dark. Mornings like this were sacred, moments of solitude before the demands of the day took hold. Nathan was no stranger to responsibility. A volunteer deputy with the county sheriff's office for over a decade, he carried the weight of duty with quiet resolve. In Willow Creek, he was known as a man who fixed problems, whether it was a neighbor's dispute or a stray dog causing havoc. His home, a single-story ranch with a neatly trimmed lawn, blended seamlessly into the neighborhood's uniformity. His mailbox, a standard black model, stood unremarkably at the curb. His porch held two simple wicker chairs, their cushions faded but functional. To the untrained eye, Nathan's life was unexceptional. But beneath the surface, he was a man of iron will, forged by years of confronting chaos with clarity. As he sipped his coffee, the tranquility of the morning was shattered by a sound that set his instincts on edge. A loud, aggressive knock at his front door. The force of it reverberated through the house, as if someone were trying to break through rather than announce their presence. Nathan's brow furrowed. He wasn't expecting visitors, and certainly not with such audacity. Setting his mug on the side table, he rose, his movements deliberate but unhurried. Years of training had taught him to approach the unknown with caution, not haste. He crossed the living room, the floorboards creaking faintly under his boots, and peered through the peephole. What he saw was so absurd it nearly drew a laugh. 3 men stood on his porch, dressed in mismatched uniforms that looked like they'd been cobbled together from a thrift store. Their badges glinted in the morning light, but even through the distorted lens of the peephole, Nathan could tell they were cheap imitations. The tallest of the trio, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and mirrored sunglasses, stood at the forefront, his posture rigid, as if he were auditioning for a role in a low-budget crime drama. His 2 companions, younger and less assured, flanked him like nervous understudies. Nathan opened the door, his expression a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The mustached man stepped forward, his chest puffed out, and flashed a badge that looked more like a child's toy than an emblem of authority. "Sir," he said, his voice deep and rehearsed, "we need you to step outside immediately." Nathan crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "And who might you be?" "We're with the HOA enforcement unit," the man declared, his tone dripping with self-importance. His lackeys nodded in unison, one clutching a clipboard, the other fidgeting with what appeared to be a pair of flimsy handcuffs. Nathan blinked, his mind racing to process the absurdity. "The HOA has an enforcement unit now?" he asked, his voice laced with mockery. "We do," the mustached man replied, lifting his chin. "And we don't tolerate non-compliance." The words hung in the air, as ridiculous as they were ominous. Nathan had heard tales of the Willow Creek HOA's overzealous regulations. Fines for unapproved paint colors, warnings for overgrown hedges. But this was a new level of farce. He studied the trio, noting the ill-fitting uniforms, the nervous glances exchanged between the lackeys, and the mustached man's theatrical bravado. Something was wrong, and Nathan's instincts, honed by years of spotting deceit, told him this was no ordinary overreach. The mustached man reached into his pocket, producing a crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it with exaggerated flourish, as if presenting a royal decree, and began to read. "You have been cited for an unapproved mailbox design and unauthorized lawn furniture." Nathan's gaze flicked to his mailbox, its black finish unmarred and identical to every other in the neighborhood, then to his porch, where the two wicker chairs sat innocently. "My mailbox?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "What's wrong with it?" "It doesn't conform to the HOA's latest aesthetic guidelines," one of the lackeys piped up, glancing at his clipboard as if it held the secrets of the universe. "And my lawn furniture?" Nathan pressed, gesturing to the chairs. "Unapproved," the mustached man stammered, his confidence wavering as he consulted his paper for support. Nathan fought the urge to laugh. The situation was so ludicrous it bordered on performance art. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "You're trying to arrest me over a mailbox and some chairs? This isn't a joke," the mustached man snapped, stepping closer. "Non-compliance with HOA ordinances is a serious matter. You're coming with us." Nathan's amusement faded, replaced by a steely resolve. "And where exactly are you planning to take me?" "To our holding facility," the man replied, his chest swelling with false authority. Nathan couldn't hold back a chuckle. "You mean to tell me the HOA has a jail?" "It's not a jail," the man growled, his face reddening. "It's a compliance center." The words were so absurd Nathan nearly lost his composure, but the glint of the handcuffs in the second lackey's hand sobered him. This wasn't just a prank. These men, however ridiculous, believed they had the power to intimidate him, perhaps even detain him. The thought ignited a spark of defiance in Nathan's chest. He'd faced down real threats in his years as a deputy, from armed suspects to volatile disputes. He wasn't about to be cowed by a trio of impostors playing dress-up. "I see," Nathan said, rubbing his chin as if considering their demand. "Well, gentlemen, I hate to break it to you, but I'm a little busy today. I'll have to decline your invitation." The mustached man's patience snapped. "That's it," he shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Nathan didn't budge. "Or what?" he asked, his tone calm but unyielding. The second lackey stepped forward, brandishing the flimsy handcuffs. They looked like they'd snap under the slightest pressure, but the intent behind them was clear. "Do it now, sir, or we'll be forced to take action." Nathan's eyes narrowed. He'd seen enough. These men weren't just overzealous HOA busybodies. They were part of something darker, something that reeked of fraud. He shifted his stance, his hand brushing the small radio clipped to his belt. With a subtle press of a button, he sent a silent distress signal to his colleagues at the sheriff's office. The move was instinctual, a precaution born of years navigating danger. He kept his gaze locked on the mustached man, his expression betraying nothing. The mustached man grinned, mistaking Nathan's compliance for surrender. "That's right," he said smugly. You're learning your place. Nathan's lips twitched into a faint smile. Oh, I know my place, he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made the lackeys shift uncomfortably. As the mustached man barked orders, Nathan calculated his next move. He could hear the faint hum of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The impostors hadn't noticed, too consumed by their own performance. Nathan let them talk, let them dig their own grave, as he prepared to turn the tables. The morning that had begun with coffee and calm was now a battleground. Nathan Daniels, a man who valued order but despised tyranny, stood ready to expose the truth. The HOA's so-called enforcement unit had picked the wrong man to intimidate, and they were about to learn just how costly that mistake would be. The air on Nathan Daniels' front porch crackled with tension, the morning sun casting harsh shadows across the three impostors who dared to challenge him. The mustached man, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting Nathan's unyielding gaze, stood rigid, his faux authority fraying at the edges. His two lackeys, one clutching a clipboard, the other fumbling with flimsy handcuffs, shifted nervously, their confidence eroding under the weight of Nathan's calm defiance. The distress signal Nathan had sent moments earlier hummed silently in the background, a lifeline to the real law enforcement closing in. But Nathan wasn't waiting for backup to take control. He was done playing their game. The mustached man, sensing his grip on the situation slipping, leaned forward, his voice a forced growl. You're making a mistake, Daniels. Step outside or we'll drag you out. Nathan's lips curled into a faint, steely smile. Try it, he said, his tone low and unyielding, each word a challenge carved in iron. The second lackey, a wiry young man with a nervous twitch, took a hesitant step forward, raising the handcuffs as if they carried real weight. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, he stammered, his voice betraying his fear. Nathan's eyes locked onto him, piercing through the facade. Son, those cuffs wouldn't hold a toddler. Put them away before you embarrass yourself further. The mustached man's face reddened, his patience snapping like a brittle twig. Enough, he barked, reaching for Nathan's arm in a desperate bid to assert dominance. It was the wrong move. In a single fluid motion, Nathan sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it with practiced precision. The mustached man yelped, his sunglasses sliding down his nose as Nathan spun him around, pinning his arm behind his back and forcing him against the hood of their unmarked SUV. The impact sent a dull thud echoing across the quiet street, the vehicle's HOA enforcement logo glaring under the morning light. The clipboard lackey froze, his papers fluttering to the ground, while the handcuff wielder stumbled backward, his bravado evaporating. Stay down, Nathan commanded, his voice a blade cutting through the chaos. The mustached man struggled briefly, but Nathan's grip was unrelenting, a testament to years spent subduing real threats. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the morning stillness. The lackeys exchanged panicked glances, their amateurish scheme unraveling before their eyes. Nathan leaned close to the mustached man, his voice a low growl. You picked the wrong house. Now let's talk about who's really under arrest. Before the imposters could react, two sheriff's department squad cars screeched into Nathan's driveway, their red and blue lights painting the street in stark relief. Deputy Ryan Brooks, a seasoned officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped out of the lead vehicle, his hand resting casually on his duty belt. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, Nathan holding the mustached man against the SUV, the two lackeys frozen like deer in headlights, and a crowd of curious neighbors beginning to gather at the edge of their lawns. Boss, Ryan called, his tone carrying a hint of amusement as he raised an eyebrow. Mind telling me why you're wrestling a guy in what looks like a Halloween costume? Nathan released the mustached man, stepping back and brushing his hands off as if ridding himself of filth. These three were attempting an unlawful arrest, he said, his voice steady but laced with contempt. Claimed their HOA enforcement, citing me for my mailbox and shares. Tried to cuff me and take me to their compliance center. Ryan's gaze shifted to the trio, his expression hardening. IDs. Now, he ordered, his voice flat but commanding. The mustached man, still rubbing his wrist, tried to regain his composure. He straightened his sunglasses and puffed out his chest, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. We're authorized by the Willow Creek HOA, he said, producing a wallet and handing over a plastic badge engraved with HOA Compliance Officer. It was laughably crude, the kind of trinket sold at party stores. Ryan flipped the badge over, inspecting it with a smirk. You've got to be kidding me. This wouldn't pass muster at a school play. He raised his eyes to meet the mustached man's. Which department issued this? Because I've never heard of an HOA running a SWAT team. The mustached man faltered, glancing nervously at his lackeys. We were authorized by the HOA board to enforce neighborhood regulations, he said, his voice wavering. Ryan's eyebrow arched. Authorized? Where's the paperwork? I don't see anything here that checks out. You're not even registered as security guards, let alone cops. The clipboard lackey, a lanky man with shaggy hair, piped up, his voice cracking. We've got jurisdiction over this whole neighborhood. The board told us to do this. Ryan turned to Nathan, his expression skeptical. You sign off on any of this? Nathan shook his head, his eyes never leaving the impostors. Not a chance. This is as bogus as it gets. Ryan exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. He flipped through the fake IDs, each one more pathetic than the last, and turned back to the mustached man. So, let me get this straight. You've been running around, pretending to be law enforcement, threatening people over mailboxes and lawn chairs? That's your big plan? The mustached man's face flushed, his voice rising in desperation. It's not like that. We're enforcing compliance. People need to follow the rules. Nathan stepped forward, his presence commanding the scene. Compliance, he said, his voice cold and cutting. You're extorting homeowners with fake fines. That's not enforcement. That's a shakedown. Ryan nodded, his disgust palpable. He turned to the shaggy-haired lackey. How much were you charging people for these violations? The lackey shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to his comrades. No one spoke. Nathan crossed his arms, his gaze unrelenting. No answers? That's fine. Let's check your vehicle. Ryan didn't wait for permission. He strode to the SUV, its garish HOA logo a mockery of legitimacy, and yanked open the driver's side door. Inside, he found a treasure trove of evidence. Stacks of ticket books, printed fine notices with fabricated violations, and a small metal cash box bulging with bills and checks. He let out a low whistle, pulling out the cash box and holding it up for Nathan to see. Well, 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 Ryan said, his voice dripping with disdain. Looks like someone's been raking in more than just HOA dues. Nathan joined him, bending over to inspect the contents. The ticket books listed absurd violations, unapproved flower beds, non-compliant fence heights, even unauthorized birdhouses. The fine notices demanded payments ranging from $200 to $2,000, with threats of liens or foreclosure for non-compliance. The cash box contained thousands in small bills, likely collected from intimidated residents too afraid to question the officers. This isn't enforcement, Nathan said, his voice a low rumble. This is a racket. Ryan slammed the SUV door, his expression grim. He turned to the impostors who stood frozen, their faces pale with the realization that their scheme was collapsing. You've been making threats, collecting fake fines, and impersonating law enforcement, Ryan said, his voice sharp. That's fraud, extortion, and a whole lot of jail time. The mustached man, his bravado gone, made a last-ditch effort to salvage his position. We were just following orders, he blurted, his voice cracking. The HOA board told us to do this. They promised us a cut of the fines. Nathan's eyes narrowed, his suspicion confirmed. Orders from who exactly? The board, the mustached man muttered, his gaze dropping to the ground. They said we could keep 30% of whatever we collected. Ryan exchanged a glance with Nathan, his eyes widening. Sounds like we're dealing with a bigger problem than a few fake cops, he said, his tone resolute. This goes straight to the top. Nathan stepped closer to the mustached man, his voice a controlled burn. You've been scamming your neighbors, threatening their homes, their livelihoods, for a cut of the profits, and you thought you'd get away with it? The lackeys fidgeted, their fear palpable. The shaggy-haired one dropped his clipboard, its pages scattering across the lawn. The handcuff wielder looked like he might bolt, but the sight of Ryan's hand resting on his holster kept him rooted in place. Ryan took charge, his voice cutting through the tension. "You're under arrest for impersonating law enforcement, fraud, and extortion. Hands behind your backs." The mustached man made a feeble attempt to flee, lunging toward the SUV, but Nathan was faster. With a swift move, he grabbed the man's arm, twisting it behind his back and forcing him to the ground with controlled force. "Nice try," Nathan said, his voice laced with grim satisfaction. "But you're not going anywhere." Ryan cuffed the mustached man, his movements swift and precise, while another deputy secured the lackeys. The shaggy-haired one dropped to his knees, muttering, "We didn't mean for it to go this far," but his words fell on deaf ears. Nathan stood tall, his gaze sweeping over the scene. The squad car's lights flashed, neighbors whispered in awe, and the impostor's reign of terror ended in handcuffs. But Nathan knew this was only the beginning. The real culprits, the HOA board pulling the strings, were still out there, hiding behind their titles and bank accounts. He turned to Ryan, his expression resolute. "We've got the pawns," Nathan said, his voice a vow. "Now we go for the kings." The crowd of neighbors grew, their murmurs turning to cheers as the fake officers were loaded into the squad cars. Willow Creek was waking up, and with it, a spark of rebellion against the corruption that had held them captive. Nathan felt the weight of their trust, their hope, and he vowed not to let it falter. The takedown was complete, but the war was far from over. The dust of the morning's confrontation still lingered in the air as Nathan Daniels and Deputy Ryan Brooks stood amidst the flashing lights of the squad cars. The three fake officers, their cheap uniforms now rumpled and their bravado shattered, were secured in the back of the sheriff's vehicles, their faces ashen with the weight of their unraveling scheme. The neighborhood of Willow Creek buzzed with a mix of shock and tentative hope as residents gathered in small clusters, whispering about the audacity of the impostors and the swift justice Nathan had delivered. But Nathan's focus was elsewhere. The pawns had been taken, but the real architects of this fraud, the HOA board, remained untouched, hiding behind their polished titles and air-conditioned offices. Nathan's jaw tightened as he turned to Ryan, his voice low and resolute. "These clowns were just the muscle. The board's the head of this snake, and I'm not letting it slither away." Ryan nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd of neighbors, some clutching receipts, others holding crumpled fine notices. "We've got enough to start building a case," he said, his tone as hard as granite. "But we need to move fast. If the board gets wind of this, they'll start covering their tracks." Nathan's gaze drifted to the HOA office, a nondescript brick building at the edge of Willow Creek's central square. It was a place most residents avoided, a fortress of bureaucracy where complaints went to die and fines were borne. Behind its glass doors, the board members sat, insulated by their self-appointed authority, believing themselves untouchable. Nathan's blood simmered at the thought. They had preyed on their neighbors, weaponizing petty rules to extort thousands, threatening homes and livelihoods for profit. This wasn't just greed, it was betrayal, a violation of the trust that bound a community together. "Let's go," Nathan said, his voice a command. "We end this now." The two men moved with purpose, their boots crunching against the gravel as they crossed the street toward the HOA office. The crowd parted to let them pass, their murmurs growing louder, a chorus of support and anger. An elderly woman, her hands trembling as she clutched a stack of fine notices, called out, "Sheriff Daniels, make them pay!" Nathan gave her a curt nod, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every resident who had been silenced, bullied, or bankrupted by the board's greed. Inside the HOA office, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The air was cool, the hum of fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over polished wood paneling and framed certificates touting community excellence. The receptionist, a young woman with a nervous smile, looked up as Nathan and Ryan entered, her eyes widening at the sight of their badges. "Sheriff Daniels, Deputy Brooks," she stammered, rising from her chair. Is something wrong?" "We need to see the board," Nathan said, his tone leaving no room for debate. Now. The receptionist hesitated, her fingers hovering over the phone. They're in a meeting. I can tell them to clear their schedule, Ryan cut in, his voice sharp, unless they want us to drag them out in cuffs. The receptionist swallowed hard, then picked up the phone, her voice trembling as she relayed the message. Moments later, a door at the end of the hallway opened, and Alan Moore, the HOA board president, emerged. A thin man in his late 50s, Alan carried himself with the practiced arrogance of someone accustomed to power. His suit, though expensive, hung loosely on his frame, and a nervous twitch in his left eye betrayed his unease. Behind him, the other board members followed, 4 men and 2 women, their expressions a mix of feigned confidence and barely concealed panic. Sheriff Daniels, Deputy Brooks, Alan said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. This is unexpected. To what do we owe the visit? Nathan stepped forward, his presence filling the room. Don't play dumb, Moore. We just arrested 3 of your so-called enforcement officers for impersonating law enforcement, fraud, and extortion. They're singing like canaries and they're pointing the finger at you. Alan's smile faltered, his twitch intensifying. I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding, he said, his voice strained. We hired those men to enforce our regulations, nothing more. If they overstepped, that's on them. Nathan's eyes narrowed, his voice a controlled burn. Overstepped? They were shaking down residents for thousands, threatening foreclosures over mailboxes and lawn chairs. And they did it on your orders. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to one another. A woman in a navy blazer, her hair pulled into a tight bun, spoke up, her voice shrill. We had no knowledge of any illegal activity. We trusted those men to act within the law. Ryan snorted, pulling a stack of papers from his satchel, the evidence collected from the impostors' SUV. Then explain this, he said, slamming the papers onto the conference table. Ticket books, fine notices, and bank records spilled across the polished surface, each document a damning testament to the board's complicity. These show fines funneled into your personal accounts. You didn't just know about the scam, you orchestrated it. Alan's face turned a sickly shade of pale, his hands trembling as he reached for a glass of water. This is a mistake, he stammered. We were trying to maintain order. Residents were complaining about non-compliant properties. You thought you could line your pockets by terrorizing your neighbors, Nathan interrupted, his voice ablaze. You turned this community into your personal ATM, and you didn't care who got hurt. The room fell silent, the weight of Nathan's words settling like a storm cloud. The board members, once so assured in their authority, now looked like cornered animals. One of the men, a heavy-set figure with a receding hairline, tried to deflect. We had legal counsel. We were told our actions were within our rights. Ryan's eyes flashed with contempt. Your counsel can join you in court then. You signed off on fake citations, authorized illegal arrests, and pocketed the profits. That's not governance. That's organized crime. Nathan stepped closer to Alan, his voice low and menacing. You threatened people with losing their homes. You made them live in fear, all so you could buy another vacation house or a fancy car. Did you think no one would fight back? Alan's shoulders slumped, his facade crumbling. He stared at his hands, unable to meet Nathan's gaze. We didn't mean for it to go this far, he muttered. The fines were supposed to be a deterrent. When the money started coming in, it got out of hand. Out of hand, Nathan repeated, his voice rising with controlled fury. You extorted thousands from people who trusted you. You betrayed this community, and now you're going to answer for it. Ryan flipped through the financial records, his finger jabbing at a series of transactions. These show over $200,000 in fines deposited into accounts linked to this board. You didn't just profit. You built a system to keep the cash flowing. That's not a mistake. That's a conspiracy. The board members exchanged panicked glances, their unity fracturing. The woman in the blazer whispered to her colleague, her voice barely audible. We need to call our lawyer. You'll get your phone call, Ryan said, his tone icy, right after we book you for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. Nathan's gaze swept the room, locking eyes with each board member. You thought you were untouchable, sitting in your fancy office, writing rules to bleed this neighborhood dry. But you underestimated Willow Creek. You underestimated me. Alan slumped into a chair, his face a mask of resignation. The other board members followed suit, their defiance evaporating as the reality of their situation sank in. Nathan and Ryan stood like sentinels, their presence a promise of justice. The evidence was ironclad, the witnesses numerous, and the community's anger a tidal wave ready to crash. As Ryan began reading the board members their rights, Nathan stepped to the window, looking out at the growing crowd outside. Neighbors held signs scrawled with demands for justice, their voices rising in a chant that echoed through the square. An older man, his face lined with years of worry, clutched a receipt for a $1,500 fine he'd paid to save his home. A young mother stood beside him, her eyes fierce as she recounted threats over her non-compliant garden. Willow Creek was no longer a community of silent victims. It was a force awakened, united by the truth Nathan had uncovered. Ryan joined Nathan at the window, his voice quiet but firm. "This isn't the end, you know. We've got the board, but we need to follow the money. Make sure no one else is pulling strings." Nathan nodded, his expression resolute. "We'll tear this thing apart piece by piece. No one gets away with betraying these people." As the board members were led out in handcuffs, the crowd erupted in cheers, their voices a thunderous declaration of victory. Nathan felt the weight of their trust, their gratitude, and he carried it like armor. The masterminds had been unmasked, their empire of fraud exposed to the light. But the fight for Willow Creek was far from over. Nathan would see it through, no matter the cost, until every cent was returned and every wrong made right. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over Willow Creek as the last of the HOA board members were led away in handcuffs. The once sterile square outside the HOA office now pulsed with life, a sea of residents united in a shared reckoning. The air was thick with the sounds of voices, angry, relieved, triumphant, mingling with the fading wail of police sirens. Nathan Daniels stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed, his weathered face set in a mask of quiet resolve. Beside him, Deputy Ryan Brooks surveyed the scene, his sharp eyes noting every detail. The elderly couple clutching receipts for fines they'd paid under duress. The young father holding his daughter's hand as he recounted threats over a non-compliant fence. The group of women exchanging stories of fear and defiance. Willow Creek was no longer a neighborhood cowed by tyranny. It was a community reborn, forged in the fire of truth. The takedown of the HOA board had been swift and merciless, but Nathan knew the wounds they'd inflicted ran deep. For months, perhaps years, the board had operated like a shadow government, wielding petty regulations as weapons to extort their neighbors. Fines for unapproved mailboxes, threats of foreclosure over lawn ornaments, demands for thousands to correct imaginary violations. These were not mere annoyances, but assaults on the dignity of every resident. The evidence Ryan had uncovered, bank records showing over $200,000 funneled into the board's personal accounts, fake citations issued by impostors posing as law enforcement, painted a picture of calculated greed. Yet as Nathan looked out at the faces of his neighbors, he saw not just victims, but survivors, ready to reclaim their power. A murmur rippled through the crowd as an older man, his faded golf cap tilted at an angle, stepped forward. His name was Henry Caldwell, a retired mechanic who had lived in Willow Creek for 3 decades. His hands trembled as he held up a crumpled fine notice. Its ink faded, but its threat still potent. $2,500 for an unauthorized shed he'd built to store his tools. "Sheriff Daniels," Henry called, his voice rough but steady. "They told me I'd lose my house if I didn't pay. I scraped together every penny, went without groceries for weeks. Is this really over?" Nathan met Henry's gaze, his voice firm but laced with empathy. "It's over for them, Henry. Hold on to that notice. We'll make sure you get every cent back, and then some." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising like a tide. Henry's eyes glistened, a weight lifting from his shoulders as he nodded, clutching the notice to his chest. Nathan's promise was not just words, it was a vow, backed by the iron will that had carried him through the morning's confrontation and the unmasking of the board's corruption. He knew the road ahead would be long, with legal battles and financial audits to ensure justice was served, but for now the people of Willow Creek needed hope, and he would give it to them. Ryan clapped Nathan on the shoulder, his voice low. "You've got their trust, boss. That's no small thing. But this isn't just about refunds. We need to make sure this never happens again." Nathan nodded, his jaw tightening. "We'll tear their system apart. No more fake fines, no more threats. These people deserve a neighborhood that serves them, not exploits them." As the squad cars pulled away, carrying the disgraced board members to the precinct, the crowd began to organize. A woman in her 50s, her hair streaked with gray, stepped forward with a clipboard of her own. Not a tool of oppression, but a symbol of action. Her name was Clara Evans, a former school teacher known for her sharp mind and unyielding spirit. "Sheriff Daniels, Deputy Brooks," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "we're starting a committee. We want oversight, transparency, and a new board that answers to us. Will you back us?" Nathan's eyes met Clara's, recognizing the fire of someone who had been pushed too far. "You've got my support," he said, his tone resolute, "and the sheriff's department's. We'll work with you to rebuild this HOA from the ground up." Clara's lips curved into a determined smile, and the crowd murmured in approval. The idea of a community-led HOA, free from the corruption that had plagued it, sparked a new energy. Neighbors began sharing ideas, monthly open meetings, public financial reports, elected board members with term limits. A young man, his sleeves rolled up to reveal tattoos from his time in the military, suggested a neighborhood watch to ensure no one could impersonate authority again. An elderly woman, her voice soft but firm, proposed a fund to help residents recover from the fines they'd paid. Each voice added to a growing chorus, a blueprint for a Willow Creek that stood for its people, not against them. Nathan listened, his heart heavy with the weight of what had been lost, but buoyed by the strength of what was being built. He thought of the stories he'd heard that day. Families who had drained their savings to avoid foreclosure, retirees who had lived in fear of losing their homes, single parents who had faced impossible choices to appease the HOA's demands. The board's greed had fractured the community, but now in the wake of their downfall, Willow Creek was stitching itself back together, stronger than before. As the crowd dispersed, some heading to the community center to begin organizing, others lingering to share their stories, Nathan and Ryan walked toward their patrol car. The square, now bathed in the soft light of dusk, felt different. Lighter, as if the shadow of fear had lifted. But Nathan's mind was already on the next steps. The financial records needed to be audited, the board's assets frozen, and every resident compensated. There were questions, too, about how deep the corruption ran, whether the board had connections to other scams, or if their legal counsel had been complicit. Nathan would leave no stone unturned. Ryan glanced at him, his expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. "You know, for a volunteer deputy, you've got a hell of a knack for shaking things up." Nathan gave a small, grim smile. "Just doing my job, but this one's personal. These are my neighbors." As they reached the car, a young girl, no older than 10, ran up, her pigtails bouncing. She held out a folded piece of paper, her eyes wide with admiration. "Mr. Daniels, I drew this for you," she said, thrusting the paper into his hands. Nathan unfolded it, revealing a crayon sketch of a man in a sheriff's hat standing in front of a house, a crowd cheering behind him. The words "Our Hero" were scrawled in uneven letters at the top. Nathan's throat tightened, a rare moment of softness breaking through his steely exterior. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "This means a lot." The girl beamed and ran back to her mother, who waved gratefully. Nathan tucked the drawing into his pocket, a reminder of why he fought. Not for glory, but for people like her. Ordinary lives caught in the crosshairs of greed, now free to thrive. As Nathan and Ryan drove toward the station, the fading light painted the horizon in hues of orange and purple. Willow Creek settled into a new rhythm, its streets alive with the sounds of neighbors reconnecting, planning, and healing. The HOA's reign of terror was over, replaced by a community that refused to be silenced. Nathan knew the work was far from done, but for the first time in years, he felt the pulse of something greater than justice. Hope. Willow Creek was reborn, and he would stand guard to ensure it never fell again. 6 months had passed since the handcuffs clicked shut on the HOA board members, their empire of fraud crumbling under the weight of truth. Willow Creek, once a neighborhood suffocated by fear and petty tyranny, now breathed freely, its streets alive with the hum of a community rediscovered. The scars of the HOA's reign remained: empty savings accounts, lingering distrust, stories of hardship whispered over backyard fences. But they were healing, stitched together by the resilience of those who had stood up and said, "No more." At the heart of this transformation stood Nathan Daniels, a man whose name had become synonymous with justice, though he wore the title of hero with quiet unease. On a crisp autumn morning, Nathan stood on his front porch, his black mailbox gleaming in the sunlight, its standard design a silent testament to the absurdity that had sparked his fight. His two wicker chairs, once deemed unauthorized, sat proudly, their faded cushions now joined by a small table where neighbors often stopped to share coffee and stories. The air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant laughter of children playing in the park, a sound that had been muted during the HOA's darkest days. Nathan sipped his coffee, the same bitter blend he'd always favored, and surveyed the neighborhood. It was different now, stronger, united, alive. The aftermath of the HOA scandal had been as relentless as Nathan's pursuit of justice. The financial audits, led by a task force that included Clara Evans and other community leaders, uncovered a web of corruption that stretched beyond Willow Creek. The board's ill-gotten gains, over $300,000 in total, had been funneled through shell accounts, some linked to a shady real estate firm with ties to other HOAs across the county. Every cent was seized, and a restitution fund was established to repay residents who had been extorted. Henry Caldwell, the retired mechanic who had gone without groceries to pay a $2,500 fine, received his refund with a handwritten apology from the new HOA board, a gesture that brought tears to his eyes. Families like the young mother who had faced threats over her garden were compensated, their faith in their community slowly restored. The legal battles were fierce but decisive. Alan Moore and his fellow board members faced charges of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy, their trials a public reckoning that drew crowds to the courthouse. The fake officers, desperate to lessen their sentences, turned state's evidence, revealing the board's explicit instructions to intimidate and extort. The testimony was damning, and the convictions unanimous. Alan, once a smug tyrant in an ill-fitting suit, was sentenced to 7 years, his nervous twitch now a permanent fixture as he was led away. The others received similar fates, their wealth and status stripped away, leaving them to face the consequences of their greed. But justice was more than punishment. It was rebuilding. The new HOA, born from Clara's community committee, operated with transparency and accountability. Monthly meetings were held in the community center, open to all, with financial reports posted online and board members elected by popular vote. Term limits ensured no one could cling to power, and a neighborhood watch led by the tattooed veteran who had spoken up that fateful day patrolled to keep impostors at bay. The restitution fund grew into a community trust, supporting projects like a new playground and a scholarship for local students. Willow Creek was no longer just a place to live. It was a place to belong. Nathan remained a volunteer deputy, his days filled with the same quiet duties that had always defined him: mediating disputes, checking on elderly residents, teaching kids to ride bikes safely. But his role in the HOA takedown had changed how Willow Creek saw him. Children drew pictures of Sheriff Daniels in their classrooms, their crayons capturing his sheriff's hat in resolute stance. Neighbors stopped by with homemade pies or invitations to barbecues, their gratitude unspoken but palpable. At the community app store, By the Iron Stand, A Tale of Defiance Against HOA Fraud, by XAI, ebook, first drawing of Nathan, a simple stick figure with a sheriff's hat, still hung on his fridge, a talisman of the day he'd stood up for his community. Yet Nathan shunned the spotlight. When Clara and the new board proposed naming a park after him, he declined, his voice firm. "This wasn't about me," he said at a community meeting, his words carrying the weight of truth. "It was about all of us. Let's keep it that way." Instead, the park was named Unity Green, a nod to the collective strength that had toppled the HOA's tyranny. Nathan attended its opening, standing at the back of the crowd, his arms crossed as children played on swings and neighbors laughed over picnic tables. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough, a quiet guardian watching over a community reborn. Not all wounds healed easily. Some residents, burned by years of betrayal, remained wary, attending meetings with skeptical eyes, questioning every decision. Nathan understood their caution. Trust, once shattered, took time to rebuild. He made a point to attend every HOA meeting, not as a leader but as a neighbor, listening, nodding, offering a steady presence. When disputes arose over fence heights or tree placements, he mediated with the same calm resolve he'd shown that morning on his porch, reminding everyone that rules existed to serve the community, not to oppress it. One evening, as Nathan sat on his porch, a familiar figure approached, Ryan Brooks, now promoted to sergeant, his badge glinting in the fading light. Ryan carried 2 beers, handing one to Nathan as he settled into the second wicker chair. The 2 men sat in comfortable silence, the clink of their bottles a small toast to their shared victory. "You ever think about running for sheriff?" Ryan asked, his tone half serious. "You'd win in a landslide." Nathan chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm no politician. I'll stick to keeping the peace right here." Ryan grinned, taking a sip. "Fair enough, but you've got a legacy now, Nate. This place won't forget what you did." Nathan's gaze drifted to the horizon, where Unity Green's lights glowed softly against the dusk. He thought of the girl who'd given him the drawing, of Henry's trembling hands holding his refund check, of Clara's fierce determination to rebuild. His legacy wasn't in statues or titles. It was in the laughter of children, the open doors of neighbors, the absence of fear. "Maybe," Nathan said, his voice low and steady, "but the real legacy is them. They're the ones who stood up." As night fell, Willow Creek settled into a gentle rhythm, its streets safe, its people empowered. The HOA scandal had been a crucible, testing the community's spirit and forging it anew. Nathan Daniels, the man who had sparked the fire, remained its quiet protector, his coffee mug ready for the next morning, his resolve unbroken. The iron stand had held, and Willow Creek would never fall again.